Hello and welcome to Gun Violence in Missouri, Seeking Solutions, presented by the Kansas City Star in partnership with American Public Square at Jewell. I'm your host, TORIANO Porter, opinion writing for the Star editorial board. Gun violence in Missouri has been described as a public health crisis that has devastating consequences on communities across the state. Missouri leads the nation in which Black people were fatally shot. In Kansas City, roughly 3/4 of homicide victims this year were Black, even though only 30% of the population is African American. Decades of research have shown that a main driver of violence is the lack of trust between police and the community they are sworn to protect. During the last several months, the Star has interviewed more than 75 residents, activists, faith leaders, and survivors of gun violence as part of our newsroom's Missouri Gun Violence Project, undertaken in partnership with nonprofits Report for America and Missouri Foundation for Health. Today, we've assembled a group of panelists who are not only passionate about reducing gun violence in Kansas City, but also rebuilding trust between police and the community it serves. They are also focused on offering solutions to broker peace as the city tries to slow the homicide rate. The goal of today's event is to engage community members and work together to develop long-term solutions to reduce violent crime. We want to have a civil, fact-based discussion about how to move this city forward. As part of American Public Square and Kansas City Star programming, we welcome questions and requested fact checks from the audience. Please comment on the live stream with your questions and requested fact checks. KC Star Breaking News editor Ian Cummins will serve as today's fact checker. Before we get started, I would like to thank our event sponsors, Health Forward Foundation, Lead Bank, and KC Common Good. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Please welcome Dr. Barbara Johnson. A retired teacher and professor, Barbara is a longtime community activist. At the ripe age of 75, she has a unique perspective on how over-policing has eroded trust in the community. Barbara joins us today to offer insight on how to improve their relationship.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
BRITTANY NIETO is the Community Violence Program Manager at the Giffords Law Center to prevent gun violence, where she focuses on using data to support violence reduction efforts in communities that have seen the most significant impact of violence. BRITTANY will share community-driven strategies for addressing violence. Chris Goode is the founder and owner of Ruby Jean's Juicery in Kansas City and a current board of commissioner for the Kansas City Parks and Recreation Department. He has sponsored a measure. He has been outspoken on equality issues affecting minorities in the city and has sponsored a measure that led to the removal of the J.C. Dinkle statue and street name near the Country Club Plaza. Also joining us today is Major Brad DEICHLER, Executive Officer for Kansas City Police Chief Rick Smith. Major DEICHLER has spent the last 20 years in patrol at various ranks. Currently, he is the right-hand man for Chief Smith. Major DEICHLER's background includes training work and helps oversees the training program for autism awareness for law enforcement in the region. Guys, thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
And we'll dive right into it. Kansas City has experienced this year its worst level of gun violence ever. The city recently recorded its 159th homicide, the most we've seen in 1 year. A firearm was used in all but 21 of the deaths, according to police data. The question, what factors have contributed to this record level of murders in the city? Major DEICHLER, you work alongside Chief Smith. Let's start with you. You're muted. Major DEICHLER, can you hear me? Yes, we can't hear you though, sir. We'll figure that out and we'll move on. Barbara, do you have any idea of why the murder rate has been so high in Kansas City this year?
I would suggest that there's at least three major emphasis, and that would be education, work or jobs, whatever you want to call it, employment. And of course, there's always the idea of some kind of justice. That makes sense. So housing, education, work or jobs, as we call it, and then an effort to make this community a part of human beings, as opposed to just treating them as Black folk or, you know, whatever you call them. But it's not being treated humanely, that's for sure.
Okay, and Chris, what are some of the societal issues that you believe are contributing to Kansas City's violent crime problem?
Thank you, Toriano. So first and foremost with me, I mean, I think I want to make sure we have the appropriate tone because this isn't just another conversation, another panel. Yep. It's something it's very, very, very near and dear to many people's hearts. You know, there are people losing their loved ones for this. So I first want to give anyone who's lost someone to gun violence, you know, my condolences sincerely, because it's conversation without really understanding the weight of it is can get lost. And for me, I think that we can identify where these gun violence issues occur. We know the pocket that they live in, right? And so as soon as we say that, we know that we're on the east side of Kansas City, east of Truce, in an area that has been forcefully created to be devalued in many, many different ways. Not only are the schools, were they allowed to underperform at some point? Not only is the area being over-policed, is there a lack of culture, of art, a lack of health access, a lack of outdoor fitness opportunities, and so on and so forth. But I believe that if we focus our attention just specifically on the area where we see the majority of these crimes occur, then we'll see that this community is really crying out. And we've been downtrodden and we've been overlooked and underserved for far too long, and it's spilling out in this manner.
Thank you, Chris. And before we move on to the next question, I wanted to circle back. Major Deichler, have you figured out if you're still muted or not, sir? You're still working on it? Yeah, sounds like you're still muted. So we're going to make sure we get him straightened out, guys, because we really want to hear the Major's point of view on this. So, Major, if you keep working on your end to try to get your microphone set up, that'll really help this conversation. But we'll be patient with you, sir. We're gonna include some questions from our audience in today's program. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Brittany, this question is for you. Viewer Ingrid Burnett wants to know, what would your policy recommendations be to reduce gun violence here?
I think that the situation here in Kansas City is is somewhat indicative of patterns that occur all across the country, and there are certainly solutions to help mitigate gun violence here. Part of that is certainly enacting stronger gun laws at the state level, which has been a challenge here in Missouri, certainly for a very long time. But beyond those sort of policy solutions, there's also evidence-based, community-driven approaches that have shown a tremendous amount of success in cities all across the country. Some of these solutions include group violence intervention or focused deterrence, hospital-based violence intervention programs, or evidence-based street outreach programs. A popular one is Cure Violence. Many of these strategies have reported or have shown up to 60% declines in gun violence over just a few years. These strategies are also often far less expensive than some of the more enforcement-focused efforts that we're engaged in more commonly. So my policy solutions for Missouri, well, I think they have to largely be also coming from the community. I think these sort of strategies that I've outlined have a track record of success and could make a real difference here in Kansas City.
Okay, thank you. And I know Barbara touched on a little bit earlier, socio-economical issues leading to gun violence. And Chris, I wanted to ask you, do you think a lack of access to education and quality opportunities has helped drive violence here?
I do. I think that if we as a city, we have to look at it as a system, right? The city is a system, and then there's smaller pockets of that system. And then if we can identify exactly that we know that these murders are occurring far and above in this one specific area, then we have to look at that system that was created. If we've created a system where people are forced to live in this area And then that very area is devalued in every single way. Our schools are allowed to underperform. There are food deserts running rampant. There's blight every way you look. I think that we can clearly identify that we need to rework the entire system so that Black people aren't overlooked, they aren't undervalued, they aren't oppressed, and so that they aren't hopeless, because that hopelessness, it breeds really, really bad things. Because if I can't see more than 10 feet in front of me or beyond what just happens today, or I'm living check to check and I don't have the same opportunities as my counterparts, there's going to be a bad result. So we can't create a system, specifically create a system and force Black people into that system. And then when it starts to spill out in a manner of violence and hopelessness, be surprised that our gun rate, our death rate, our murder rate is astronomical. The system is broken from its very, very core. And so we need to look back at the system and how we rework the different things in that system.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate that. And Bob, I wanted to follow up with a question about mental health support and conflict resolution. Those things can help reduce crime, but has a lack of access to adequate health care among Black residents contributed to what we have seen and what we're talking about today, a high level of gun violence?
Well, I was going to address it another way. Kansas City is a hyper segregated city, and that's been true since 1968, when the so-called movement to so-called integrate the schools that never happened. And by the time I returned back to Kansas City 10 years later, what we saw was a remaining hyper segregated city, and it was about schooling, which was not about education. There's a difference. So what we found was, when we came back to the schools, they had so-called integrated the schools with just white female suburbanites, females. And then all of a sudden, high suspension rates, no learning. I was teaching at one time at Penn Valley. Kids couldn't pass a comprehensive exam to save their soul. So what do you think was going on inside those schools? And so that's one of the things I first saw. That meant that our boys couldn't possibly get a job because they couldn't read and write well enough. Then all of a sudden, you also find that the gun violence becomes rampant. And I think that was all planned, if you ask me. It's no accident that all of this has been true. And if you've gone left and come back, you really see it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Johnson. And Major, I understand you got your audio mic fixed up. Audience member Jennifer wants to know, what is Kansas City going to do to address the trauma of gun violence in our communities? Is that something that's a topic of discussion within the police department?
It sure is. Do you have something more specific? That's a very broad question. I mean,
yeah. What do you guys have any outreach that you could do to work with the city leaders to expand trauma, address trauma in the city?
Well, there are a couple of things that we're doing. I think we're doing with a lot of success. Some of them were in the beginning phases, but our social workers who are assigned to each division play a big role in that. We use our social workers. We use a lot of our CIOs. We've got a variety of outreach programs. We've partnered with local ministers here recently. I think the shortest and easiest answer is to say, everybody here understands how important that is. Everybody in the leadership piece of KCPD understands there is much trauma inside the community, and no one looks at that trauma and says it's not important. So we're always trying to come up with solutions, but we are law enforcement and we don't have all the answers. So that's part of the reason I'm here today to participate. One of the things that I'm hoping comes from our conversation today, and hopefully conversations in the future, is that we can talk to each other about strategies that will be more effective, because I grew up in the urban core. To be quite honest, I had some family that had interactions with law enforcement. My father spent a lot of time in the legal system and experienced a lot of trauma. So I know what it looks like firsthand, to be honest. And I can tell you that everything that we're throwing out solution-wise, it's not working. But we know, and we're not delusional, that we are going to need lots of help from anybody we can get help from. And part of that starts with having conversations and working with the community and bringing more voices to the table.
Okay. And Brittany, would you like to offer some strategies or solutions for this conversation in regards to trauma in the community and how we can address that?
Approach that.
Brittany?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I think any approach to reducing gun violence in some of our most impacted communities must have a must work through a trauma-informed lens. There is a lot of pain in communities, and you're dealing with a lot of actual post-traumatic stress, a disorder, like real illnesses, mental illnesses that are also perpetuating pain in the community. And so I think a part of, and other folks have touched on this, is there are a lot of root causes to violence here in Kansas City and elsewhere. And the most impactful strategies for reducing violence address those root causes. So if you're going to have a strategy that's focused on reducing homicides and shootings, it should take a trauma-informed approach. It should use credible messengers who can interact with members of the community who are considering picking up a gun or engaging in some form of retaliatory violence and can relate to them and engage with that and engage and help heal that trauma. Our communities need healing, and too often they just have not received it.
Thank you. And this is a two-part audience question from Abby, and this is for you, Major Deichler. In reference to Missouri gun laws, Abby wants to know, has Missouri gun laws affected the ability of police to do their job, to get bad guys off the street?
Well, I'm going to answer that in a very general way. I would say the gun laws have had very little impact right now. Most of the gun situations that we encounter, the guns are already considered illegal. So in regard to that, the other situation that we encounter a lot is that we are unable, if someone is involved in gun crime at a felony level, to keep anybody in jail. So, and we're not looking to incarcerate everyone. That is not the goal. But when we have repeat offenders, and if someone picks up the telephone and calls KCPD 911 and says, this individual is involved in violence against me or my family, we frequently will make an arrest, process the individual, and many times this person will be back out on the streets very, very quickly. These are felony level crimes. Sometimes they are repeat offenders multiple times. But I will say that the gun laws, as they exist now, they don't have very little impact on what we do. What impacts us greatly is lack of jail space, and the prosecution is sometimes slow or not at all.
Okay, and that was the follow-up. What changes, if any, would help the investigation and prosecution efforts with these gun crimes?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. I feel that, and I'm hoping that one of the things that comes from this conversation today is that we are able to engage the community in a positive way, to apply pressure not just to KCPD, but to the prosecutor, to the folks in Jeff City. We can take a look at the laws. We can take a look at the prosecution. It's a team effort, but it's not KCPD by themselves. It's not the community by themselves. I think that if we continue to have these conversations, and I do not want to throw any individual under the bus at all, but I will tell you, having a lack of jail space is critical. Prosecution is critical, and those things do not happen all the time.
Thank you. Violent crime is a longstanding issue in Kansas City, where we have struggled with violent crime rates far too many years. What in Kansas City history has led us to this moment? When did the city start to see some of these issues that have contributed to this record-breaking homicide rate in 2020? Barbara, you have experience.
Yes.
Could you talk about this?
Yes. Part of the problem with this particular city as a hyper-segregated city, it was always more akin to the slave patrols. It was patrolled as if we were already and everyone criminals. The other part of it was there was no due process. In other words, it seemed to be about filling correctional facilities. Missouri is one of the highest states with correctional facilities. We have 26 right now. So what does that tell you a lot about our sentencing process? Something's wrong about that beginning end, which is lies in our schools, lies in our communities, and the disconnect between what policing does as slave patrols versus what they should be doing as community policing. So that's part of the difficulty, and it hasn't changed. And I have been here and been out of here, come back in, and it's the same story. And so our boys seem to understand that their high suspensions in school leads to prison, and that's exactly where many of them go. And something's wrong with Missouri having this many correctional facilities.
Thank you. And Major, you've been around for a while. Can you tell us about your thoughts on why this year has been so rough?
I can, and I want to back up to something that Brittany said a few minutes ago. She was talking about folks being in trauma and people being in crisis. We have trained almost every police officer over the last 2 years in CIT, and this is a 4-hour course to recognize mental health, stress, and duress. Toriano, I honestly believe that some of the political discourse that's taking place in the United States has upped the anxiety. I think it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on or if you're in an aisle, people are more stressed and distressed. I think COVID, the lack of employment, general anxiety kind of permeates. It permeates in what we do in our organization. It permeates in city government. I think it permeates in everybody's household, in the schools. So you've got a lot of stress and anxiety, plus people are out of work. And when people are having a hard time making a paycheck, you can't get your kids in school, mom and dad are stressed. So all of this stress and anxiety builds up. And I can tell you, we're seeing high levels of crime and certain levels that we haven't seen in years, like domestic violence, is way up. And so where I'm going here is I just think that the general stress that's being experienced in the United States contributes to what we're seeing, because please understand, and I want your audience to understand, the elevation in violent crime is not just happening in Kansas City. This is happening in major cities across the United States. It is way up, and I'm not going to say it's in every city. I can't say that. But what I can tell you, we talk to other cities a lot. Violent crime in large cities, and we're not really a large city. We're kind of a medium-sized city, but small towns, medium cities, large cities, the crime is way up, and the violent crime and the gun crime is way up. So I do think the anxiety and the general stress between the COVID and the politics, I really do think it's noticeable in what we do.
Yeah, Major, you said something, and I want to backtrack to the illegal guns you spoke of. What is the department doing to determine where these illegal sales are coming from, or these legal weapons, and how do we get them off the street?
That is the million-dollar question. Now, we work that with our federal partners. We work it locally with our own employees. We have a variety. As you know, most people see on-duty cops in a police car. We have all kinds of specialized units that work gun crime. We work with the ATF. We work with the FBI. But I can tell you, Toriano, and you know this, and your listeners know this, we take a lot of guns off the streets, but we're not winning. I can tell you that, and the homicide numbers tell you that. And it's not just the homicide numbers. When you think about what we call the bullet to skin numbers, which is someone pulls the trigger and actually hits another human being with a round, those numbers are skyrocketing. And there are a lot of guns on the street. Some of them are legal, some of them are illegal. We do a lot to take guns off the street. And as you know, we just worked in Operation Legend. Some folks didn't like that, some people did. But a big chunk of Operation Legend was designed to take guns off the streets. Now, I can tell you a lot of those guys and gals in Operation Legend, they've left town. They've gone on to their next assignment. We're still here. You're still here. The people in the community, we're not going anywhere. And the guns are still here. So we don't have all the answers on that. It's something we work on all day, every day. But it sometimes feels like we are running against a tidal wave. We take guns off the street, more guns come back to the street. And guns don't just come from Kansas City, Missouri. Guns are brought into the city from all over the country.
Okay. And Dr. Johnson has said she would like to see more officers of color in the community and wonders why there have not been an increase in the number of minority police officers. Major, can you
Well,
address your recruiting efforts? Yeah.
I would love to address that, and I heard her mention that yesterday, and I think she asked a great question, and I do not blame her for asking that. We have about 13% of our employees are officers of color. Now you're getting into an area that's near and dear to my heart. So in my 30 years, 20 years, I spent in a police car, but I spent a lot of time teaching, coaching, mentoring, and a big chunk of that is for trying to bring minority officers into the PD. I want to tell your listeners something that I find to be very important. And I know some people are probably going to disagree with this, but I'm going to tell you from firsthand experience. And this is, you have fact checkers. This is very easy to fact check. It is very, very hard to be a minority police officer. It is incredibly difficult. I will use the situation at the plaza as a case in point. I stood on the line for many, many, many days, every day, in fact. And the officers that took the most abuse, by far, not even questionable, were minority police officers. They received verbal abuse from black, white, brown, didn't matter the demographic. People heap verbal abuse on our minority officers at a level that I don't think I've ever seen, and I've been here 30 years. I know I have trained a lot of minority police officers. My best friend is a retired 30-year police officer. He's black. His dad was a retired 30-year police officer. And I will tell you what both of those men told me. It is incredibly hard to be a black police officer in Kansas City, Missouri. They lost a lot of friends, a lot of family did not support them. I'm not trying to blame friends and family. I'm telling you, it's not about getting them here. We get them signed up. It's about retention. Once we get a black police officer or a Hispanic police officer, or a female for that matter, it's incredibly difficult to keep them because this is a really hard occupation for them, because they receive a lot of what I think, I don't want to say abuse, but I will say, I think it's harder because if you are living in Kansas City, Missouri, and your family and friends tell you we don't like what you do for a living and you hear it all day, every day, I think it makes it very hard to stay here.
That's an excellent, excellent answer and insight. Thank you for that, Major. We're going to shift gears here a little bit. Earlier, we spoke about the fractured relationship between Kansas City Police and, frankly, the Black community here. These deep-rooted issues did not just start today, but again, we're here to offer solutions. So, Brittany, I want to ask you, how important is it for the community to trust its police department, and what are some of the things we all can do to make sure we broker that trust?
Well, having trust between a community and the police department is really one of the most essential factors that contributes to public safety. There's little more dangerous that a police force can do than lose the trust and legitimacy from the community, and this can happen through large and small interactions. It can be through a high-profile incident of police brutality, or through just regular negative interactions with your community. And what happens when you lose trust, when you lose the trust of your community, a very small percentage of that community might decide to protect themselves by carrying weapons, feeling that law enforcement either is unwilling or unable to keep them safe.
Okay.
And the smaller percentage might decide to join up with a gang or some sort of clique or group, or something that's less formal, and engage in retaliatory violence, feeling that they've just had a loved one murdered in the community and aren't seeing justice for it, because not all across the country, a significant number of homicides of Black Americans go unsolved. They never get an arrest, let alone a conviction. And at the same time, our criminal justice system just wreaks havoc on the same community by, I believe that there's more arrests for, and again, there are fact checkers, so I welcome this, but there are more arrests for personal marijuana possession in this country than there are for all violent crimes. It's just it's an injustice, and And frankly, it reinforces a narrative that that law enforcement can't or won't keep people safe, and that's not true. I think our law enforcement does want to keep people safe, but it reinforces a negative feedback loop. So you end up stuck in this cycle of distrust and violence.
And Major DEICHLER, I'm sure you guys have heard these concerns before. What is the department's current strategy on repairing the trust in the relationship in the community?
Well, we have heard a lot of this, and that no one is going to sit at KCPD and say that trust is where we would like it to be. To Brittany's point regarding marijuana being a gateway into making a lot of arrests, it's not something we do. And as you probably already know, Toriano, marijuana arrests in Kansas City, Missouri are, I don't want to say non-existent, but certainly not a priority. Having said that, we have worked with our officers at the line level. And it's important to understand, we have community interaction officers. We have PAL, we have DARE. We have every type of support training you can think of for specialized units. Our most important piece is the guys and gals in the police cars. You've got 800 people in police cars that work out there day in and day out. Those are the folks that we are working with the most to make sure they understand they're the ambassadors. They are the folks that are on the ground level. They're going to make more contacts in one day than all of our specialized units put together. So we want our police officers in the police cars to understand what it means to be part of the community. Yes, are we going to have to make arrests and do enforcement? Absolutely. Is that the only tool in the tool belt? No, it's not. And we want our officers to understand, to have community trust, we cannot be heavy-handed. We cannot overreact. Everything is not about arrest and enforcement. That is a message that we are sending day in and day out from the top down, because this is not an us against them thing. And everybody knows we're not going to arrest ourselves out of any situation. I'll be honest with you, we don't want to do that. If you told me today, Toriano, that KCPD doesn't have to make any more arrests because we're crime free, we'd throw a party. But we want other solutions other than taking people to jail, because jail is not going to change the behavior anyway. And I've heard many people mention opportunity, jobs, education, take care of some of the trauma, take care of some of the anxiety. I believe in all of these things. And I think these are the things that help the best. We have, and to that point, and I want to make sure that I get this out, we work with young people all the time. And I can tell you, and everybody thinks that there's a lot of animosity in the community. We get a lot of positive feedback inside the community. We know that we make mistakes. We know that we're not perfect, but we get an amazing amount of feedback from every neighborhood in Kansas City, Missouri, that folks believe in us. They want us to succeed. They want us to work with them, not against them. We're reaching out to young people. We have police academies. We have BOW. We have DARE. We have Lead to Read. We have a variety of programs designed for the youth all the way up. We have SROs in schools. So we're trying to work with kids from grade school on up. And we're trying many, many strategies to connect with the community. But I do want to make a point, and Toriano, I think you know this, we've only talked a couple of times. I'm not a believer in we're going to lay down the law and do all the arresting and just come in and put the gotchas. I don't like that. I don't want that. Our chief doesn't want that. It doesn't work anyway.
Thank you. A viewer wants to know, a viewer, Rhonda, she keeps remembering the question. She wants to know, basically, building trust is a two-way process. And right now, many police officers are just as distrusting of Kansas City residents as residents are police officers. What steps are both sides willing to take to build trust? As Rhonda points out, Kansas City police officers need to trust citizens. What needs to happen to ensure this goes both ways? Chris, you want to chime in on this?
I think, when you come at me from my perspective, frankly, it's less about the badge and more about the bridge. And by bridge, I mean, when you have a reoccurring issue on your skin over and over, you keep going back to the doctor, they're not going to just give you some cream and just say, oh, it'll go away for a little bit. When we just focus on what is spilling out today, we just forget about the true root of it, right? And so we're being reactive, in my opinion. And that trust is secondary for me. For me, it's more about, if we know, and Major Deichler pointed this out, anxiety is up way high. Now, me being passionate about people's health, anxiety and the food that we eat day in and day out has a direct correlation. And please fact check that, because there's been numerous studies that show the food that we put in our bodies day in and day out have a direct correlation to our mental health from an anxiety perspective, as well as depression. And so if we know that to be true, and then we look at this very, very identifiable area, and we know that this community is very, very unhealthy, even in our hospitals, in our schools, very, very little access to healthcare. It's less about the badge and more about building that bridge to those people. And for me, one way that we can very clearly and actionably create a better bridge is pour in more resources so that people are incentivized to eat healthier in these very specific areas of the 3rd and 5th districts. Talking at a high level about the results of this, this oppression it's almost counterintuitive for me, because it's like, if we know that the system is flawed and we know that this section of the city has been pushed away in so many different circumstances, in so many different ways, we have to go back and say, it's more about the people that are in the communities, and how can we make them healthier people? How can we make them happier people? How can we give them more resources, right? And there's very specific ways in Kansas City to do that. And so this conversation should be more focused on the people that are in this area and how we make them healthier and how we make their vision different than what it is today.
Major, can the police department reconcile its relationship in areas where residents believe they're over-policed?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I want to make sure that I'm not going to try to quote an exact number, but Toriano, I want to make sure that I get this point in. We get over 1 million calls a year, and the overwhelming majority of the calls are complaint-free. Now, here's the tricky part, and Chris makes a good point about anxiety. And I spent 20 years out of my 30 in a police car, and I want to tell you sometimes what happens. If Major Deichler, who is then Officer Sergeant Deichler, makes 12, 13 calls in a day, and 12 of them are great, and then Toriano, you call me, or Barbara or Chris calls me, and I come out on your vehicular or your burglary, and I just left a suicide or a rape or a homicide, and my anxiety level is out the top. And then I say something that is not professional. I do something that is very offensive to you. I can tell you those complaints come to us, we work them, and they are sustained. I know a lot of people say they don't believe in the complaint system. I can tell you we work them and we sustain them. But I would ask this, Toriano. I would ask that your listeners understand one thing. Sometimes we need a little grace. And when a police officer is working 10, 11, 12 hours in a day and they make a call and they say something that you find offensive or you find a little bit crazy, I would ask that you remember they may have been out there a long time. They've got a lot on their plate. I'm not saying that you excuse them. I would absolutely say bring it to their attention and bring it to their supervisor's attention. But I know for me as a sergeant, I was a sergeant for 17 years. If someone called me and said, Sergeant Deichler, your police officer said this to me, and it really offended me. In fact, it embarrassed me, or, he was inappropriate or she was inappropriate, I would show up and we would try to do a mediation right there on the spot. And we would try to talk it out. And I'm asking for your listeners to at least understand we're human. We are asking for a little grace when we say and do things that we know are not what we should do. I will tell you the overwhelming majority of our calls, I think we handle with high professionalism, but I know there's some that are not. But I would rather someone call me and say, Major Deichler or Sergeant Deichler or whomever, this happened. And as Chris said, there have to be bridges, because if we blow up the bridges, we just get what we got, which is we're having problems. I want to back up for just 1 second on Chris's point about the food. I worked Powell for 3.5 years. We fed those kids every single day. We've given out 500,000 meals this year. There are a lot of kids in this city that are hungry. There are a lot of families that are trying to feed their kids. And when you're hungry and you're distressed, all that stress rolls over to mom, dad, the caretakers, and the kids. And those things create situations where people call us and they say, KCPD, we have this problem or that problem. But you get down to root basic causes. People are hungry, they're unemployed. That is not something that we can fix by ourselves. And us showing up with guns and badges isn't going to change the fact that that kid hasn't had anything to eat.
Thank you, Major. And Grace, we all deserve and need a little grace. Thank you for that. Which leads us to our next segment, which is the economic impact of gun violence. And Barbara, I want to ask you this question. The economic disinvestment in Kansas City urban core has affected the crime rate. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm going to always go back to the three things that a human being absolutely needs. And that's going to be that we have some type of work, that we have housing particularly. And we live in the most deteriorated area of Kansas City. And just think about that a moment. That's deliberate too. So we've gone from, and I keep going back to this idea of a hyper-segregated city. There are some things that are done to a city that is hyper-segregated, which means you blight it, you let it deteriorate because you really are not concerned about the people that are there. Then you also make it a food desert. That's been deliberate too. It took us 10 years to get a store inside of the 3rd district. This is ridiculous, but you could put, I don't know how many liquor stores. Those are the kinds of things that make no sense, and people are looking and trying to figure this out. But if you have to really know the history of this city and how it has processed Black and brown and white issues. And we can't get away from our history as long as we keep seeing generationally the same things being done. I don't know if we just don't want to see, or is it that we prefer the blindness that is how we are treating each other. If you know that this city was hyper segregated for a reason, then we need to kind of go back and say, okay, so why did the housing issue? Why the food desert? Why the education? And why the employment issue? Those three are critical. I mean, there's no getting around it. So like our pastor says all the time, you have to do what's right, what's fair, and what's just. And until we address that way, we're going to continue to have these kinds of problems. I'm 75 and I haven't seen a lot of changes since I was 16. Right. I'm just real certain of that. And I've been in and out of this city because I was a military spouse. And I got to live other places. And let me say to you very clearly, that hyper-segregated city and the connection to these jails, 26 correctional facilities, that's on purpose. So let's don't fool ourselves.
Okay, thank you. And because we're live and we have fact checkers, we are going to fact check something that Brittany said a little earlier about a marijuana arrest and drug possession. Around the country, police make more arrests for drug possession than they do any other crime. The reports find, citing FBI data, more than 1 of every 9 arrests by state law enforcement is for drug possession, amounting to more than 1.2 million arrests per year. And that's coming from Washington Post. Thank you for that. Now, Chris, you have been driving home economic investment this afternoon. You're a business owner. Your business is in the urban core. How important is it to invest in the urban core as it relates to what we're talking about here, violence?
TORIANO is paramount. It's paramount, and it can't be just an arbitrary statement. It has to be real and tangible and actually occur. I'm saying this from the perspective of a young Black man that was a low-income kid at what is now Operation Breakthrough, and now is the owner of the only and first all ever healthy establishment on the entire east side of Kansas City. Now, let me say that again. Mm-hmm. The only all healthy establishment ever in the history of our city on the entire east side of Kansas City. I'm not proud to say that, right? I'm not proud to say that because there's a lack of interest in investing in the ways that really, really enrich a community. And I think that we can look at very, very tangible issues. For instance, right now, as you know, TORIANO, there is a $43 million soccer complex being proposed that was initially approved by the majority of our city council. Only 3 council members voted against this $43 million project that will be funded by public tax dollars. All right, let me be clear about this because it's very, very specific. It's not this high level statement. It's actually in Kansas City. It's actually on the table today. So on November 4th, our city council will take into account what should happen about this $42 million project for Sporting KC in the Northland. That $43 million that is being funded by taxpayer dollars, essentially poor people's money, should not be going to fund this plush soccer complex. It should be directed into the Life X zip codes, into the parks, into the schools, into making sure that when the officers hand out food, that it's not trash food. When the schools serve our kids food, that it's not processed, that it's not packaged food, that it's healthy, it's nutritious. It actually can impact the kids, because it's easy to look at what's going on today and say, you know what, these are the outcomes, so let's focus on that, as opposed to looking at our babies, right? If our schools are funded by the state for each meal, for any low income kid under the poverty level for a certain amount, if our school is funded by our state, they shouldn't be funded to provide processed food and food that's going to encourage anxiety, encourage depression, which after decade and decade of being stacked on top of each other, now I'm a 20-year-old and I've been eating processed food, if I got to eat, to Major Deichler's point, and then I'm expected to be all hunky-dory and nice to the people on my blighted block. It's insane. And until we look at the resources that we already have and we already are expending and we redirect them, right, from an economic standpoint, there are developers from Denver coming into Kansas City being incentivized to develop land on the east side of Kansas City, land that was devalued for them to come back and take at a very, very small amount of money and then make big money from it. So we should be able to force them and say, you know what, 1% of your resources that we are incentivizing from a tax perspective should go into this district specifically geared towards increasing culture, art, food disparity on the east side of Kansas City, tangibly, not just talking about this stuff, but forcing the things that we can force. And then all of the nonprofits in Kansas City, can we ask them, hey, can you take 0.00 whatever percent of your annual budget and pour into this as well? Because we know it's going to impact us all, not just the residents of the east side. It's going to impact Kansas City as a whole. But until we get to the point that we actually invest our dollars, as I have and others have, and people are doing this work, we force our hospitals to not fry foods that are getting funded by our state. We force our schools to provide nutritious meals for our kids that are going to be these kids we're talking about killing each other. Then we're not going to get anywhere. We're just going to be talking about this stuff.
Thank you, Chris. Brittany, from the Giffords Law Center's perspective, what's the economic impact of gun violence in Missouri?
In Missouri, there are about $1.9 billion in directly measurable costs that are attributable to gun violence in Missouri. This includes healthcare costs, law enforcement and criminal justice expenses, cost of employers, and as well as lost income. But in addition to that, there's also about $3.6 billion in costs attributable to reduced quality of life and pain and suffering. So that brings it to about a grand total of $5.5 billion per year as the cost of gun violence in Missouri. Just to give you a bit of context and something to compare that to, there is a violence intervention program called Advanced Peace that in many cities requires a startup amount of about $200,000 and $500,000. So we see how much we're spending on the status quo, on continuing things the way they are, and it's in the billions. But we find it difficult to make these small investments in our community and in strategies that will help address those root causes of violence. Folks have spoken a lot about some of the more preventative measures, like making sure folks have a meal. You know, it's difficult to concentrate on much else if you're hungry. However, we also have to look at if we want to see reductions in violence in the short term, or in the immediate term, rather. We want these to obviously be sustained in long term. You have to focus those efforts and providing resources and support to the people who are at highest risk of engaging in violence. I don't have the data available to me to find out what the average age of a homicide victim in Kansas City is, but I can tell you that most homicide victims are between the ages of 17 and 35. Those are adults. And that means that we need more support services for folks that are struggling in that age group. That can be access to employment opportunities, mental health services, a whole array of services that programs like Advanced Peace can help bring to communities and help directly engage those folks that are at highest risk and direct them to support services and other essentials to help them turn their lives around.
Okay, thank you. And as we move closer to a close, we want to take these last few minutes to discuss the immediate steps that can be taken to reduce gun violence here in KC Mo over the next few years. Chris, what should we do first to move Kansas City in the right direction?
We should vote against. We should not give our council the ability to essentially hide something that's using our resources, right? If we're going to publicly fund a 42, 43, however many $1 million soccer complex, it should at least be widely known about, right? We should advertise it and market it. Hey, we're going to use your tax dollars in this way. We're not going to say, we know businesses are closing. We know people are getting furloughed. We know people are hurting. We know there's a disparity in our LifeX zip codes. We know people are dying earlier in these specific areas, 3rd and 5th district. We know this, but we're still going to direct $43 million into a plush soccer complex for kids that don't have these same issues. So very tangibly, we should vote highly and boldly against the Northland Soccer Complex, and then figure out a way to just take half of that, let's say 20 million, and put it into a fund specifically for the East Side that addresses some of the issues that I already talked about, encouraging more culture, more art, more healing, more love, tangibly better food into the school supply. Because while we are looking at adults, those adults were kids at some point. And so we have to focus on the kids. We have to focus on the roots, because if the roots start to be changed and that dynamic starts to be cured and healed and molded, it will have a great outcome for adults and everyone alike.
Barbara, I'd like to ask you the same question.
I'm very sorry that I'm a broken record, but when we've built this city, I'm gonna say again, a hyper-segregated city, we've enlarged it to 312 square miles and deliberately blighted the urban core. In other words, 64128, 64130, made certain that the schools within it are not teaching. There's schooling going on, but there's no education going on. Made sure that there's deteriorating housing. The blight is unreal. Built highway, Bruce Hart Watkins so that you could circumvent the inner core. Everything to me looks like it's just about someone with a lot of power creating a system that cannot be fixed unless we finally redirect TIF money, the money that young Good is talking about, redirect money and funds back to the core and sincerely work to do housing, education, and employment for these Black babies. And until that's done, we're going to keep having this cry. And yes, it's unfair. Let's just be honest. You need to be right, fair, and just, period.
Thank you. And Brittany, what immediate steps can be taken to reduce gun violence here over the next few years?
An immediate step that can be taken to reduce gun violence here would be investing in violence intervention and prevention programs. In Oakland, California, for example, the city invested in a strategy called Oakland Ceasefire, and within just 5 years, the gun homicides and shootings in that city dropped by 50%. So this is doable, and or by nearly 50%. So this is doable, and many communities are seeing a lot of success with evidence-based strategies. So I would encourage members of the Kansas City community to maybe check out some of our reports on various violence intervention strategies, find one that works for this community, and advocate around it. Funding is always a huge hurdle in these situations, and so the state also should step up and start funding community-based efforts that I'm sure are already in existence in Kansas City. Good community-based organizations that are providing the sort of essential services and supports that the community so desperately needs. So the state needs to invest in those, and also that would be beneficial if the state could pass more gun laws. Right now, the Missouri was ranked third for most permissive gun laws in the nation. It earned an F on our scorecard, and there are just too many guns on the street. So I think a combination of investment in violence intervention and prevention programming, as well as stronger gun laws, can make a really strong difference here in Kansas City.
Okay, and before we go to Major DEICHLER and get his thoughts on what the police department is doing, we definitely want to do a couple more fact checks. We're going to add a little local context to Brittany's earlier comment about marijuana possession. Based on Kansas City Police Department reports and reporting from KCUR, numbers do not show more marijuana arrests than gun-related arrests in Kansas City. Approximately 821 marijuana arrests versus 1,000 gun-related arrests last fiscal year that ended April 30th. So we just wanted to check that. And on Chris Goode's comment, research shows there's a link between nutrition and mental health. For instance, from the Journal of Pediatrics study of 120 children and adolescents, consuming fast food, sugars, and soft drinks was associated with a higher prevalence of diagnosed attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Thank you for our fact checkers. Thank you for our audience for that. Now I want to circle back. Major DEICHLER, what are some of the things, what are some of the solutions the police department is proposing or exploring, and how do we improve community building and communication with law enforcement?
Two brief points since we're toward the end. One of the things we are focusing on is de-escalation, and that's just simply asking our officers and folks in the community to slow down, take a breath, and to engage in talking before we ramp it up into anything that is violent. The other piece that I think is very important, and I will just say very simply, is we need more Barbaras and more Chris's, because Barbara is focused on education. Chris has become an entrepreneur. If you look at what they've accomplished on the East Side, we need more folks like that. These are examples. And when you're a young kid and you're trying to figure out your path in life and you look up and you see a Barbara or a Chris, you have an example of what I think is a very positive path. So the more voices that we bring to the table that demonstrate an example, such as these two, I think that's a great thing.
Thank you, Major. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time, but I did want to take this time to thank our panelists for such an insightful and constructive conversation. Thank you guys for joining us here.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And before I let you guys go, I just want to make sure our audience know who you are. Dr. Barbara Johnson, Brittany NIETO, Chris Goode, and Major Brad DEICHLER from the Kansas City Police Department. Thank you guys so much for helping us to understand the challenges facing our city and to identify solutions that can move us forward. I would also like to thank our sponsors who are supporting these important efforts. Report for America and Missouri Foundation for Health are partnering on the STARS Missouri Gun Violence Project. And Help Forward Foundation, Lead Bank, and KC Common Good sponsors today's event. Thanks to you all. The Kansas City Star will continue doing its job investigating the causes, consequences, and possible solutions to gun violence in Missouri. If you want to support these efforts and the Star's in-depth reporting and solutions-focused community engagement, please visit kansascity.com/Missouri Guns. Finally, if you enjoyed this program and believe conversations like this are important, please consider becoming a member of American Public Square. APS members help support programs and allow us to continue providing a space for civil, fact-based discussion. You can learn more about membership and its benefits by visiting AmericanPublicSquare.org. Thanks to everyone who joined today's conversation. We will continue this dialogue in the coming months, and we hope that you will join us. Have a great afternoon.